So welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today I'm delighted to have my friend Anthony here, and two of us are going to present the 12 Virtues of Rationality. So here's how we're going to do it. It's going to be quite a feat to cover these 12 virtues well in this short amount of time. So here is what we're going to do. I have a presentation. I'm going to share screen periodically so you can see the descriptions of these virtues. Hopefully you've read these already, but if not, that's fine. We're going to go through each of them. So I will go ahead by putting up the text on the screen. I will read through it. And then Anthony, who knows this much better than I do, is going to talk about that virtue. Now, please go ahead and ask your questions about each virtue as we go on. And whatever questions we think are general questions about that, we will take it right away. We will go ahead and incorporate that into our presentation of the virtue. And then we'll go through all 12 virtues like that, after which we're going to do Q&A. Okay, so but don't wait for the Q&A. You can keep asking the questions. If your question is kind of along the main line of the presentation of the virtue, we'll incorporate it right away. Otherwise, we will come to it, but we'll come to it after the Q&A. Okay, so that's the plan. So with that, let me hand it over to Anthony for a quick introduction to what these virtues are and how they came to be, and whatever else you want to say, Anthony. Go ahead.
Okay, so very briefly, the person who wrote this article, Eliezer Yudkowsky, was very interested in, I would say, predicting the future. And he believed there would be big changes, especially related to AI, and related things with like transhumanism. So, maybe something like Neuralink or more advanced versions of GPT-3. These are some things that people are working on or already exist that have done a lot of interesting things. So like, for example, you can read the GPT-3 writing samples written by a computer. They're quite good. Anyway, so these are the sort of virtues you need, according to Eliezer Yudkowsky, if you're trying to learn in a domain where there are loose or very long feedback loops. So if you're trying to predict the future, you're not going to find out if you were right for a while, right? And also, things could have gone a different way, right? So you need a different sort of attitude than if you're just learning to play chess, right? So if you're learning to play chess, first off, motivational issues are much weaker. For the most part, you just want to make the move in chess that wins you the game. You don't care if people think it looks cool for the most part, right? Whereas in many other domains, in terms of practical issues, you care about whether people around you respect you or like you. You want to look right instead of being right, at least to some level. So we're talking about domains that are, looser feedback. And these are the virtues that you might need for thinking clearly.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing the screen here. Okay, thank you, Anthony. So now what we're going to do is now we're going to go through these 12 virtues. Again, keep your notes, pen and paper, and go ahead and use the chat to ask your questions as you go on. So we thought a lot about how do you present these 12 virtues so that it's possible to kind of absorb them and to integrate them. So Anthony came up with one organization, I came up with one organization, and we chose one of them. So we're going to go through, we have divided them into 3 groups. First, the way I understand the division is first is about kind of understanding the world. The second one, and so that there we're going to cover curiosity, humility, empiricism, and scholarship. And for each of the virtues, we are going to go through the basic text. And it's actually a very short essay. So that's almost entirely all the text that he has put over there. So I'm going to read it out, and then Anthony's going to talk about it. And the second group is going to be about how do you correct your errors? How do you make sure that you are less wrong? And the third and the final group is going to be what kind of standards do you hold yourself to? So there we are going to go through precision, simplicity, perfectionism, and the nameless virtue, which kind of recaps or caps. It's like a capstone that captures all the virtues. So that's the structure of the presentation. So I've already spoiled the surprises, so you know it's coming. All right, so we're going to start with the first one, and we'll start with curiosity. So here goes. The first virtue is curiosity. A burning itch to know is higher than a solemn vow to pursue truth. To feel the burning itch of curiosity requires both that you be ignorant and that you desire to relinquish your ignorance. If in your heart you believe you already know, or if in your heart you do not wish to know, then your questioning will be purposeless and your skills without direction. Curiosity seeks to annihilate itself. There is no curiosity that does not want an answer. The glory of glorious mystery is to be resolved, is to be solved, after which it ceases to be a mystery. Be wary of those who speak of being open-minded and modestly confess their ignorance. There is time to confess your ignorance and a time to relinquish your ignorance. Anthony?
Great. So if you look at that, there's really two conditions which you need for this curiosity. You have to think that something can be figured out, that it's valuable to figure out, and that it's possible for you to actually do it. So let me give an example where you might reasonably not want to be curious. So I don't know if people know what's called the efficient market hypothesis, but it says, at least for some stocks, like heavily traded stocks like the S&P 500, then the stock price is the best price you can come up with given publicly available information. Many people believe this is at least almost true, and for someone who isn't trying to do better than that full time, you're not going to be able to come up with a better price. So if you believe this about stock prices, this efficient market hypothesis, then there's no real reason to be curious about whether a stock price is too high or too low for these publicly traded companies, right? Maybe there's a mystery there, but you can't solve it. Or there's not even a mystery there, right? The price is pretty much just right. So in order to feel this curiosity, you have to believe that knowledge is really possible and that you can attain it or find a way to attain it. And it's sort of a heroic attitude towards things.
So my question is, why is it that people are not curious? Why is it that there is so little curiosity with most people? What do you think?
Well, I think one reason, right, is that curiosity, along with all 12 of these pretty much, is sort of something that sounds nice, right? But actually following any of these virtues is sort of hard. Like if you ask yourself, what does it mean to be curious about a topic? You have to, as Eliezer says, confess that you don't already know. That's already sometimes painful for people, especially about things like relationships or raising a child or how they invested a lot of their money that took them years to make, right? You have to admit you don't actually know the best way to do it. So that's already painful. And then usually it's going to take actual hard work to figure it out. And sort of socially, what it looks like to really be curious and figure things out is often not the sort of things people reward. They sort of reward like as Eliezer says, like modestly confessing your ignorance or something, but not trying to do anything about it. You know, if you try to do anything about it, people may, it may seem like you're making a status grab or something like that. So it's not an easy virtue to really follow unless you have the right social group.
Okay, excellent. I think, it's very interesting, when I've seen people over time, when you see kids, for example, kids are naturally curious. They want to know. But at some point, people kind of lose their curiosity. There are very few individuals that I've seen who have the same level of curiosity towards the end of their life as they had at the beginning. I can see people like people like Leonardo da Vinci,
Sure.
for example. I've seen his notebooks, and there is a real kind of honest thing. Oh, I really don't know. What is this? And that it's almost like a childlike quality that is there. Even people like Newton, it's like his statement towards the end of his life was, I'm kind of roughly quoting it, that I don't know what I might seem like to other people, but as for myself, I seem to have been like a kid, playing on the seashore, who has found a shell which is shinier than another, while the entire ocean lay undiscovered. I think that is a quality that I see in everybody. Folks, if you want to ask questions at this point, you have to type in the questions, and if the questions are in the line with what we are presenting, we will go ahead and incorporate right away. Otherwise, we will do it at the end. So Sylvia, if you have questions, just go ahead and type it in. Enigma asked a very interesting question. Children are punished for their curiosity. Isn't that a conditioned behavior? Any thoughts?
I definitely think so. It's an interesting question. Why, right? I mean, most societies have some sort of dogma around how they do things. And sometimes that can be good. I don't know if anyone has talked about sort of like traditions that are fragile and hard to understand. So there were some cultures in the Americas that had a pretty complicated, or not completely complicated, but a bit complicated method of preparing corn, where you would add ashes to it. And this kind of seems dumb, but if you forget to do this, then you get vitamin deficiencies, assuming you're eating a lot of corn. And there's all sorts of things like that. So from a cultural point of view, it sort of makes some sense, right? We're in sort of a weird time historically where things can sort of be figured out from first principles, or if you question everything. I wouldn't say in the past it was impossible to make it work, but it's much easier to make it work now. Right? There's so much more information and things.
Excellent. The other thing, like for example, I remember me as a kid in India. Whenever I asked any questions about the physical world, everybody thought it was the greatest thing, and they would help me. They would be delighted to see the questions. But whenever I asked any questions about human beings, but why do we do this? Why do you say this? Why do you treat this person this way and that person that way? What's going on? I was actually kind of shouted down, slapped down, because they were saying, that's very rude to be asking such questions. So I think there is a expectation. When asked, a burning itch to know is higher than a solemn vow to pursue truth. I don't understand the sentence. Can you give an example?
Sure. So if you believe in sort of like solemn vows, then in a lot of cases, what that means is sort of like following the sort of rules or norms around how you get to truth, right? How else would you follow this vow? And a burning itch might mean sort of like questioning how things are done. So you can look at, it will come up later in this presentation, sort of psychology and other social sciences, right? Where there's all these norms around how you're supposed to handle things, how you're supposed to do data. But it's like not super clear it really works that well. If you look at the replication crisis, lots of these papers, people repeat them, they don't really work. The sample sizes aren't so big. So you could look at other people who maybe instead of getting a psych PhD, like our friend Jacob, you just sort of put out your own polls. And then that's not perfect either, but you can do it much faster. You can get much more data. So it's sort of more, also you could think of it as sort of like internal motivation versus an external locus, right? If it's sort of your own internal desire, that's another story. Like that can change things.
Excellent. So let's go to the next one.
Great.
Okay. Let me just make sure. Yes. Next one is humility. To be humble is to take specific actions in anticipation of your own errors, to confess your fallibility and then do nothing about it is not humble. It is boasting of your modesty. Who are most humble? Those who most skillfully prepare for the deepest and most catastrophic errors in their own beliefs and plans. Because this world contains many whose grasp of rationality is abysmal, beginning students of rationality win arguments and acquire an exaggerated view of their own abilities. But it is useless to be superior. Life is not graded on a curve. The best physicist in ancient Greece could not calculate the path of a falling apple. There is no guarantee that adequacy is possible given your hardest effort. Therefore, spare no thought for whether others are doing worse. If you compare yourself to others, you will not see the biases that all humans share. To be human is to make 10,000 errors. No one in this world achieves perfection. Anthony?
Yeah, so this humility is not relative humility. It's absolute humility. So that's why he talks about, the best physicist in ancient Greece, from our point of view, really did not know much physics. And unless things stall for an unusual reason, the best physicists now will not know much physics compared to what people will know in 200 years. So you want to look at the world with a sense of humility, not because you're inferior to other people, but just because everyone has so many biases, and then you want to genuinely apply them to yourself. So let me give a story that I'm sure many people have heard, right? So Daniel Kahneman wrote about biases and heuristics, and one of them is the planning fallacy. This is a bias that, at the very least, if something is going to take a while and you ask people how long it's going to take, the vast majority of the time, their estimate is way too low. Like if it's really long and takes a group, it's going to be off by at least a factor of 2, probably a factor of 3 to 5. This is true for like building projects, but even smaller things. So here's the example in question. Daniel Kahneman himself once wrote a textbook, and he talked to the other people, and it was about biases and heuristics. And they're like, look, we all know about the planning fallacy. How long is this textbook really going to take to write? And of course, they were still wrong. So even if you know about the biases in the world, you can still fall victim to them. So that's the sense in which it's a really deep humility, that really besting the issues that face everybody is not going to be easy. You can't just name it. But it's not the humility of like, I'm not good enough. It's the humility of, we all have these serious problems we're struggling with.
The interesting thing about his concept of humility and how it differs from most other people's concept of humility is that he talks about taking specific actions in anticipation of your own errors. I think a lot of the rationalist thought is about saying, okay, if this is true, what do I expect to happen, and how do I go towards it? So this also it's kind of planning for failure. So would you like to elaborate a little bit on that how it involves kind of anticipation of future?
Sure. So there's many ways you can do this. One way that is very useful is something some people call Murphy Jitsu or something like that, where you just say, okay, this went wrong. How did it go wrong? And then you sort of think it out in as much detail as you can. And then you reevaluate your plan until that failure mode seems extremely unlikely to you, right? And then you do it again. Okay, it still failed. How can we do better, right? So say you're trying to lose weight. You might say, well, it's going to fail because I'm going to get up in the middle of the night and eat whatever it is, whatever snack food you like, right? So then you come up with a plan to avoid that. Maybe you make sure you have good sleep hygiene. You sort of make sure that there's no food and easy to pick up. It's going to take a little bit of effort. Okay, how did it fail? Well, I think my family and friends are going to ask me to eat, whatever, birthday cake at parties and things like that. Then you say, fine, I'll avoid some people who I can't convince not to do that. Other people I'll talk to. okay, I still didn't lose weight. What happened, right? And this is sort of humility in the sense that most people who try to lose weight do not succeed. But it's not humble in the normal sense because you're trying to succeed. You're trying very hard. Like you believe you can do it. You just have to take a heroic effort.
Excellent. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Great.
I'm going to share the screen again. Okay, empiricism. The roots of knowledge are in observation, and its fruit is prediction. What tree grows without roots? What tree nourishes us without fruit? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, does it make a sound? One says, yes, it does, for it makes vibrations in the air. Another says, no, it does not, for there is no auditory processing in any brain. Though they argue, one saying yes and one saying no, the two do not anticipate any different experience of the forest. Do not ask which beliefs to profess, but which experiences to anticipate. Always know which difference of experience you argue about. Do not let the argument wander and become about something else, such as someone's virtue as a rationalist. Jerry Cliver said, what does you in is not failure to apply. What does you in is not failure to apply some high level, intricate, complicated technique. It is overlooking the basics, not keeping your eye on the ball. Do not be blinded by words. When words are subtracted, anticipation remains. Anthony?
Great. So as a philosophical claim, you can sort of round this off as like something adjacent to like logical positivism or something which is controversial, but as a sort of just practical claim, it makes sense, right? Even if we're disagreeing about things that are like sort of how to name things, which can be important, we can still talk about like what do we expect to happen, right? The stock market will go up or go down or stay the same, right? People, even if it's sort of like a question of like, does she love her husband or something, like maybe that's going to be difficult, but there's still the prediction of whether they'll be married in 5 years or something, right? Even if you're sort of compressing it down a little bit, it's still often more practical to talk about concrete predictions because it's much easier to make progress and to sort of catch yourself, right? You know, if you make a concrete prediction, you might be wrong and you'll have to admit you're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is huge. I mean, I think this is kind of root of, like pragmatism too, of saying, okay, you're trying to formulate concepts for action. You're trying to say, okay, you're trying to live and you're trying to know in order to live. So you're saying, okay, if I think this, what does it mean? It also puts you in a spot in the sense that you're making specific predictions. This is what I expect. If it doesn't turn out, then you can say, oh, wait a minute, what was wrong in that? So it gives you that feedback loop instead of just holding to, oh, this is what I believe. So yes. Okay. Relinquishment. Yeah, we'll go into relinquishments soon. So we're keeping a good pace here. We'll have enough time for Q&A afterwards. So let me go to the next one.
Okay.
Okay. Scholarship. Study many sciences and absorb their power as your own. Each field that you consume makes you larger. If you swallow enough sciences, the gaps between them will diminish and your knowledge will become a unified whole. If you're gluttonous, you will become vaster than mountains. It is especially important to eat math and science, which impinges upon rationality. Evolutionary psychology, heuristics and biases, social psychology, probability theory, decision theory. But these cannot be the only fields you study. the art must have a purpose other than itself, or it collapses into infinite recursion. So I want to say a few things about it, because this is like core to my approach to things. What I found is that, I got my master's in computer science. I worked for a while. And then it slowly dawned on me that I was uneducated, that I really didn't know much. Even if, for example, I kind of studied biology the way I'd studied biology or history, it was just as a kind of a rote piece of data that I had taken in. It really didn't mean anything. I couldn't really use it. So I went back and tried to study everything. What has happened is that, like most, especially in today's culture, I think it has become kind of, sequentially worse. Knowledge is divided into these silos, and people think that they can understand everything by focusing everything like a laser beam on that silo. But a lot of the really great ideas that are needed to solve problems in this silo already exist in another silo, or something equivalent of that, something analogous to that. So if you can go between fields, you can get a lot. I've seen many examples of it. The older examples are people like Leonardo da Vinci, who basically went into every field and connected fields. You can see that in his drawings. You can see it in his notebooks. In later times, the person who was very influential for me was Charlie Munger. So he had this similar idea. He calls it the tool belt. He says that I will look at fundamentals of all fields and try to extract these general purpose tools, whether it is, from thermodynamics, I will get the concept of entropy. Now, concept of entropy is applicable everywhere. Similarly, from social psychology, I will get, the concept of bias, and that I can apply everywhere. So I think that's a very powerful way of, too many people are too narrowly focused. So I think this is a point which is very close to my heart. Anthony.
Yeah, so I guess I'll just ask two questions of Shrikant on how to actually
Please.
follow this virtue. So if you're new to a field, or something in the field might be useful to you, you have to do two things, right? You have to decide where are you going to get the information. And two, you have to decide how to evaluate the information you read when you're already not an expert. So how do you do those things?
Okay. So for that, the general technique I've learned from a book called How to Read a Book. So it's called the term that this is a book called by Mortimer Adler, and I've done a full meetup on it. So when you go to our YouTube video, you can see it. I've been using it for about 20 years, 30 years. And then I recommended it to everybody in my meetup. So at least four, a dozen people read it, and 4 of them kind of do a presentation along with me of what they got from it. So I think this is the idea of that, is that you kind of you cannot depend on a single source. You have to know that you don't know much in this field. So you have to learn to scout a field. How do you scout a field? Instead of kind of diving in, if you're diving in using one person's ideas, again, you're making the same mistake. So you kind of have to be like an eagle. You have to learn to kind of take in kind of multiple books, multiple authors, and then start scanning their ideas and start relating their ideas to each other, comparing them against one another, and use that method of, the syntopical method to guide yourself. And this is a method not only for new field, but any field. So after a while you've been doing this, the next time you enter a field, it becomes easier and easier. So that's my answer. Let me see here. Clara asks, can you describe how your approach or way of educating yourself the second time was different from the first time? The first time I was young and stupid. I still a little bit of both. And I basically, I grew up in India, so I was bright and I was quite curious about certain things. So on things like physics and math, I got it right because I kind of studied, it was kind of self-driven. And I looked up whatever things I needed to look up. But on things that I did not really strike me like biology or something. I did not go deep. I just used the textbooks and tried to do well on the test or something like that. It's a very low bar. And what I found is that most teachers do not really understand of how the topic came to be. So in the second time, what I did was that I went and read the originals. So in Newton, I went and read his papers on calculus, of his take on calculus, which is much deeper, more powerful than Leibniz. I went and read Darwin on evolution, of how his story of how he came up with the idea of evolution, as well as his original works. So it was kind of going back and tracing the history of all the fields. That's how I did it. Okay, let's go to the next one.
Great. We're in a good pace.
Yes. I do this meetups all the time, Anthony, so I know how to keep pace. So we'll make sure we get done. There are lots of great questions, folks. If we don't get to the questions right away, it's because I want to make sure that we finish all the 12 virtues in time, so we have enough time for discussion afterwards. So if I don't come to your question, please ask it again at the when we come to the question and answer. So this is the second group. Anthony, you particularly like this group, and you particularly think that there is especially the first three elements are. Can you talk about this as a group?
Sure. So we'll get into them individually, but the first three can sort of be described as sort of the basics. So it's more than that, but the first one is sort of like be willing to change your mind. The second one is change your mind a lot faster. And the third one is, now that you're willing to change your mind faster, don't even be biased between things you like and things you don't like. And if you can really get to that level, it's a high level. Then you're ready for argument.
Excellent. Okay, so let's start with relinquishment. P.C. Hodgel said, that which can be destroyed by the truth should be. Do not flinch from experiences that might destroy your beliefs. The thought you cannot think controls you more than thoughts you speak aloud. Submit yourself to ordeals and test yourself in fire. Relinquish the emotion which rests upon a mistaken belief, and seek to feel fully that emotion which fits the facts. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is hot and it is cool, the way opposes your fear. If the iron approaches your face and you believe it is cool and it is hot, the way opposes your calm. Evaluate your beliefs first and then arrive at your emotions. Let yourself say, if the iron is hot, I desire to believe it is hot. And if it is cool, I desire to believe it is cool. Beware lest you become attached to beliefs you may not want. Anthony?
Great. So this virtue can sort of be summed up by the quote, right? You know, if X is true, I desire to believe X is true. You can put in whatever you want for X. So this is harder to do than you might think, right? The question is like, why wouldn't someone do that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Maybe your identity is tied up in this. You know, maybe you have a sort of religious belief. And I mean, this can be in the weeds, right? If you're a Catholic and you wind up becoming some other sort of Christian, that can be a big change in your life, even though you've remained Christian. But, you know, for people here who probably like discussion and argument, probably the most common reason is that you've already argued for the other side, and maybe people think of you as a proponent of the other side, and now you're invested. So being willing to give up things that are sort of become part of your identity is very difficult. And this is why it's often good to take steps to not let things into your identity. Just sort of maintain that sort of lightness that we'll get to.
Yeah, that's excellent. I mean, one of the things that I always think of, the framework is Daniel Kahneman's framework of System 1 and System 2. System 1 wants you to do things habitually, to stick with things that you're comfortable with, things with which you think you know. Being ready to give that up, that takes effort, that takes acting against emotions, and it is hard, and that's why most people don't do it. So kind of this willingness to give up. Let's go to the next one, because it's all these three kind of flow into each other, so it's a beautiful unit. Okay, evenness. Oh, sorry, lightness. Let the winds of evidence blow you about as though you are a leaf with no direction of your own. Beware lest you fight a rearguard retreat against evidence, grudgingly conceding each foot of ground only when forced, feeling cheated. Surrender to truth as quickly as you can. Do this the instant you realize that you are resisting, the instant you can see from which quarter the winds of evidence are blowing against you. Be faithless to your cause and betray it to a stronger enemy. If you regard evidence as a constraint and seek to free yourself, you sell yourself into the chains of your whims. For you cannot make a true map of a city by sitting in your bedroom with your eyes shut and drawing lines upon paper according to your impulse. You must walk through the city and draw lines on paper that correspond to what you see. If seeing the city unclearly, you think that you can shift a line just a little to the right, just a little to the left, according to your caprice, this is just the same mistake. Anthony?
So let me just sort of tell a story that I think doesn't make me look good, but illustrates the difference between relinquishment and lightness. So I was in an argument, and I made a point about like gun safety, which is dangerous. I don't know much about guns. And it was stuff about like safeties on Glocks. And people basically pointed out that I was wrong. And so what actually happened is that I come back and I was like kind of mad at the people who pointed out I was wrong, but I said like, all right, you have a point. Then later I come back and I'm like, okay, I was probably wrong. And now like a couple, or whenever, a couple days later, I'm like, yeah, I was completely wrong, right? So that's sort of relinquishment. I was willing to say I was wrong, but it took days, even though I was totally wrong. So with lightness, you want to just say, okay, I guess I was wrong. It's not something I know too much about. Thanks for pointing that out to me, But this is really difficult to do, especially if you've invested actual resources. So in that case, all I had invested is I made a point. Nobody thinks I'm a gun expert, right? There's very little on the line. And it still took me days to admit I was wrong to these people. What if you and your partner had to invest your money a certain way, you've chosen a certain path, you made the arguments for it, it was a bad idea, we have to switch course. Or the way you educate your children, now it's going to be really hard to practice the virtue of lightness. But the sunk cost fallacy really is a fallacy, so you should be willing to do it, but it can be challenging. Shrikant, how do you try to get yourself to practice this virtue? I think it's one of the hardest.
I mean, that's a very good question. I think one is that you kind of have to notice you resisting. You can kind of see like yourself saying, oh, you getting angry. So wait a minute, they're pointing out that I'm wrong. So it's like partly it is kind of be aware of your own reactions and say, okay, there I go again. That's what is going on. Is there a basis for that? because it's what happens is that all of this, it's all about self-awareness. I see it as about self-awareness. The more self-aware you are, because what happens, I think you give, your example was a beautiful example. I think that's the pattern for most people. And sometimes it could take years to go through this pattern that you went through for 2 days. But that's essentially the pattern. And it's a question of what happens is that I think partly what happens is as I grow older and have more experience, you realize that, you know, your ego is not that important. It is really important that you are right. That's far more important. And it is better to kind of figure it out faster. And you kind of learn to deal with the negative. It is a negative thing of saying, okay, I screwed up, and fully admitting it and doing that quickly. And I think after you've been doing this for some time, you get better at it and you realize, wait a minute, what was I so afraid of? Why did it take me so long to admit this? You know, it is true. So afterwards, you kind of see the futility of all the waiting, and you see it as you know, the time wasted. You know, you basically wasted a part of your life trying to fight against truth, try to fight a losing battle against truth.
Yeah, I mean, you would hope that eventually you're going to lose this battle.
Yes.
So, you know, might as well lose now.
Yeah. I want to pick up on one more theme that Eliezer brought up in this, and that's that of map and territory. And I think that is a very crucial distinction and crucial metaphor that he uses, which is going to be useful to us in all the other virtues that we are discussing. So can you talk a little bit about map and territory?
Right, so the map and the territory is the idea that there is an objective reality. So that's the territory. And then any map is a way of understanding objective reality. So even like a philosophical system, or, you know, the system of understanding books, or like basically all political ideas involve some way of understanding the territory, right? Because a human being cannot keep a physical, the Pacific Northwest in their mind, what, down to every tree? You can't possibly do it. So you need some way of compressing things down. And one problem is that people often will argue sort of like about the map, even in ways that are like not really about the territory. You know, like a lot of debates often wind up being like what color or what projection or something we should do on this map, as opposed to like really trying to understand it. You know, of course, how you do things can matter, but you have to bring it down to real things. This is where the virtue of empiricism comes up, right? So it's one thing to say like this, let's talk about literal maps, is going to confuse people. But that is at least a prediction about the future. You don't want to wind up arguing about trees making sounds, which is very easy to do. And you definitely don't want to get attached to positions like, I'm a trees make sounds when no one is there believer. This is a real problem for relinquishment and lightness.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I find this to be a very useful concept, and I use it in a slightly different, use it in a military context. I think of it as a military map, because what happens is that territory is changing continuously. And in order to plan your action, you need to have maps. Maps are changing continuously, and maps are tools to take your action. So those are, you know, that entire, so there is this circle, you know, you're operating at a territory that is continuously changing. You're working with maps. That's the only way you can conceptualize what is going on. And the purpose of doing that is to act and to move. And the movement is going to change the territory, and it's going, so there is like this loop that is going on. So what people, like, to put it in the context of this, is like when you're trying to hold on to an idea against truth, you're trying to hold on to this one copy of map that somehow ended up being made. And you said, the territory be damned, what I need to do be damned, I'll just hold on to this piece of paper. So it kind of looks like that to me. All right.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's go to the next one. Okay, so we did lightness. Evenness. One who wishes to believe says, does the evidence permit me to believe? One who wishes to disbelieve asks, does the evidence force me to believe? Beware lest you place huge burdens of proof only on propositions you dislike, and then defend yourself by saying, but it is good to be skeptical. If you attend only to favorable evidence, picking and choosing from your gathered data, then the more data you gather, the less you know. If you're selective about which argument you inspect for flaws, or how hard you inspect for flaws, then every flaw you learn how to detect makes you that much stupider. If you first write at the bottom of a sheet of paper, and therefore the sky is green, it does not matter what arguments you write about afterwards. The conclusion is already written, and it is already correct or already wrong. To be clever in argument is not rationality, but rationalization. Intelligence, to be useful, must be used for something other than defeating itself. Listen to hypotheses as they plead their cases before you. But remember that you are not a hypothesis, you are the judge. Therefore, do not seek to argue for one side or another. For if you knew your destination, you would already be there. Anthony?
Great. So this is why I think that these ones form a progression, right? So first, you're willing to admit you're wrong, like me in that story. Then you've gotten to lightness, so you're willing to do it fast. But now you still have to be even-handed. So this is yet a higher quest. So there's actually a lot of sort of disturbing research that people who are more politically informed or more politically partisan, and more information does not moderate this. And collectively, it can't be true that like this is a good idea, like a good thing. Like even if one side was just right, well then like half of the people are wrong, right? There's no way to spin this as good. So what is the mechanism for this? Like where learning more does not bring you closer to the truth. And I think a term many people use is isolated demand for rigor. So if someone says something that you like or you've professed agreement with, you'll hold it to one standard. But the other side, suddenly you'll bring up all the methodological flaws in the study and things like that. Now, many studies are flawed. We talked about the replication crisis. But it's one thing to be really skeptical of methodology. You know, you become like Andrew Gelman, who's a very smart professor. But if you're only skeptical of things you don't agree with, then you're like worse off than someone who never heard of the replication crisis. At least their ignorance is not in one direction. It's sort of random. That's better than being biased.
Thank you. I mean, the way I think about this is that I look at it in terms of confirmation bias concept, that it's like if you hold something, then you naturally, your system one will naturally look for things that support that. So you have to kind of systematically act against that. And I think one of the things that I've seen, this is based on Bayes' rule, we'll come to Bayes' rule, it's to kind of say, if I was wrong about this, what would I expect to see? So it's like you're trying to kind of systematically looking for saying, if I was wrong, what evidence would I see? So, and you're kind of looking for such things. So it's a way of kind of correcting for that. Okay, let's go to the next one, which Anthony said, you said that this is the most difficult one to discuss. And we can argue about this. So it's going to be about argument. So those who wish to fail must first prevent their friends from helping them. Those who smile wisely and say, I will not argue, remove themselves from help and withdraw from the communal effort. In argument, strive for exact honesty for the sake of others and also yourself. The part of yourself that distorts what you say to others also distorts your own thoughts. Do not believe you do others a favor if you accept their arguments. The favor is to you. Do not think that fairness to all sides means balancing yourself evenly between positions. Truth is not handed out in equal portions before the start of the debate. You cannot move forward on factual questions by fighting with fists or insults. Seek a test that lets reality judge between you. So, Anthony, first I'm curious, why do you think that this is a difficult, most difficult virtue to discuss?
I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that argument clearly, maybe more than any of the other ones, does not work the way it sort of should, right? Because if you have people, at least people you somewhat respect, then discussion and argument should bring you closer together. And yet we know so many people, friends, spouses, who argue the same thing for years and nothing seems to have been achieved. So we need to really change things here. The other issue is that it's not discussed a lot in society what sort of makes argument valuable, right? You know, people fighting on Twitter probably is not doing the favor to each other that Eliezer is talking about, right? So there's a lot of work to be done here.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I've been running these meetups, right? So we have people from all kinds of background with all kinds of political backgrounds. Some of them are religious, some of them are atheists, they differ from in every possible way. We are in New York, for God's sake, and what we do is that somehow we have managed to leverage the arguments fairly well. And I think there are certain kind of premises that you need to have. I mean, the way I see it is that the thing that distinguishes people who come to my meetups is that they come for a different purpose. People come for conversations, but there are different kinds of conversations. In some conversations, people are trying to signal their superiority over other people, or they are trying to kind of do small talk with almost like verbal grooming with each other to make sure that I don't want to offend you. These are very different. Or there's third kind of conversation that people engage in a lot, where they actually don't want to listen. What seems to be a conversation is people simply waiting to talk. So in all these three conversations, arguments can just go all over the place, because arguments in the first case of kind of social comity, it disturbs social comity in terms of people who just want to express their viewpoint without listening to other people. People will be shouting at cross purposes. People whose primary purpose is to establish hierarchy and signal their superiority. They actually do not care about truth. Neither of them do. They're just trying to kind of position themselves. So I think lots of the problems with argument come because the purpose is different. What I find is that if all the parties are involved in what I call joint exploration of the world, they're simply trying to say, oh, there is world out there, which is very complex. I'm trying to understand it. I understand some of it. There's a lot to be understood. Looks like you are also trying to do the same thing. Let me see what you found. Maybe I'll learn something from you. If you have that kind of approach, argument is simply, everybody is trying to point to the world and they're trying to kind of figure out. So I think it has to do with kind of premises underlying the argument.
So I think that can be true, but it still seems surprising to me that there's not more focus on like the mechanics of this. Like, again, how do you actually follow this virtue? Right, so we could say this meetup is a format for finding truth, right? And you have all this sort of social tech for running it well and productively. There are other methods, for resolving disagreements. One thing I think that helps a lot is for both participants, let's say it's a two-person conversation, to write up their views, at least sketch them out, and send them to each other before even having the conversation. So you're not just wasting time, right? But I'm not saying that's like the best system, but there seems to be like a paucity of such things. Like most formats don't seem optimized, like there's any real goal here. You know, like you talk about the military, right? If the military has a meetup during a war to talk about things, like there's really a goal. And most
Yes.
arguments don't seem very much like that.
Yeah, no, very good. You have a very good point. So what we'll do is let's work on, let's look at all the kinds of arguments in society at all scales, and let's work on that as a project. All right, let's go to the next one. I'm looking forward to that. I think both of us have interesting things to say about that, so I'm looking forward to that. All right, so with that, we are going to go to the next unit. We are doing very well on time. So we got about half an hour to wrap this up, so that we'll leave enough questions for Q&As.
Actually,
So,
let me just step away for 1 minute. I'll be right back.
sure,
Just
sure,
1 minute.
sure. So folks, now in this third unit, we are going to be focused on the standards. Various standards you should hold yourself to. So it's going to be precision, simplicity, and perfectionism. And then, we're going to talk about what Eliezer calls the nameless virtue. Basically, it's all about bringing all of these things together. Because what we're trying to do is that we're not just trying to learn them as individual separate skills. You have to figure out how do you bring all of this together. So that's what we're going to do. Okay, so let me go ahead and read out the precision to you. Precision. One comes and says the quantity is between 1 and 100. Another says the quantity is between 40 and 50. If the quantity is 42, they are both correct. But the second prediction was more useful and exposed itself to a stricter test. What is true of one apple may not be true of another apple. Thus, more can be said about a single apple than about all the apples in the world. The narrowest statements slice deepest, the cutting edge of the blade. As with the map, so too with the art of map making. The way is a precise art. Do not walk to the truth, but dance. On each and every step of that dance, your foot comes down in exactly the right spot. Each piece of evidence shifts your beliefs by exactly the right amount, neither more nor less. What is exactly the right amount? To calculate this, you must study probability theory. Even if you cannot do the math, knowing that math exists tells you that the dance step is precise and has no room in it for your whims. Anthony?
Great. So in order to understand what Eliezer is talking about here, I think you need a Bayesian framework. So in the Bayesian framework, you don't just have beliefs and reasons, you have sort of probabilities of things being true. Of course, like if it's 99%, then it's kind of close to just a belief. So this leaves all sorts of questions, right, about uncertainty and how best to model it, right? So, if you're predicting something and you give it a probability, that's one thing you can do. You can also be even more precise and give confidence intervals or, other ways of putting it as a bell curve. But even in just daily life, one problem with argument is that people express uncertainties in different ways. In fact, the defense industry, the defense agencies, have done a lot of research into what people mean if they say they're sure of something. If you dial down, some people mean 99, some people mean 85% plus. And those are real different. And all sorts of issues about how many degrees of uncertainty people can express. So within the defense industry now in the US government, there's official guidance on what people should use words to mean, what probabilities those words should correspond to, how many such words to use. And so really following this virtue requires a certain culture around it, or you at least have to explain yourself more, like put probabilities on things or whatever. Just using normal English, it's not easy to follow this virtue.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. Simplicity. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said, "Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away." Simplicity is virtuous in belief, design, planning, and justification. When you profess a huge belief with many details, each additional detail is another chance for your belief to be wrong. Each specification adds to your burden. If you can lighten your burden, you must do so. There is no straw that lacks the power to break your back. Of artifacts, it is said, the most reliable gear is one that is designed out of the machine. Of plans, a tangled web breaks. A chain of 1,000 links will arrive at a correct conclusion if every step is correct. But if one step is wrong, it may carry you anywhere. In mathematics, a mountain of good deeds cannot atone for a single sin. Therefore, be careful on every step. Anthony?
Great. So a simple story that illustrates this, I believe this is also Kahneman, did research where he described someone named Linda or something, and she really sounds like a feminist in the description. And then he asks, is she more likely to be a banker or a banker and a feminist? Well, a banker, right? I mean, she could not be a feminist, right? And a lot of people have the wrong intuitive sense of this. What they do is they just sort of see which explanation sort of feels the most resonant with what else has happened. But instead, if you look at probability theory, every additional claim is sort of multiplicative, at least if they're independent it is. It makes it exponentially less likely the more things you add. So you have to feel the weight of every additional claim. And this is a big question with like the future, right? If you start saying that you predict really detailed scenarios, well, every detail now has to come true. So much simpler claims are just dramatically more likely to be true in general.
Okay, excellent. We'll go to the next one. I want to leave enough time for Q&A. So, perfectionism. The more errors you correct in yourself, the more you notice. As your mind becomes more silent, you hear more noise. When you notice an error in yourself, this signals your readiness to seek advancement to the next level. If you tolerate the error rather than correct it, you will not advance to the next level, and you will not gain the skill to notice new errors. In every art, if you do not seek perfection, you will halt before taking your first steps. If perfection is impossible, that is no excuse for not trying. Hold yourself to the highest standards you can imagine and look for one still higher. Do not be content with the answer that is almost right. Seek one that is exactly right. Anthony?
So this one makes claims that I think, at least to many people, seem a little strong. And you might ask, like, why is that reasonable to claim? So one reason that I think is mentioned in one of the previous things is that sort of trying your best does not always achieve what you need it to achieve. You know, imagine that you had to save your child or your sister or something, some other person's life, right? Trying your best would not feel good enough. You either achieve it or you don't. and taking this kind of heroic responsibility, not just for saving your family, but for sort of humanity's future or saving the most lives in the current time, sort of requires holding yourself to this higher standard, right? Any mistake we make now could, depending on the future, have very big impacts. So we want to take it very seriously and not just say like, well, I tried, you know, because history can't necessarily judge you just for trying. You know, the results are what they are. Like, that's another theme throughout these, is that many people think in terms of like, was I a moral person? Was I a rational person? You know, did I do a good enough job? Right? Does the teacher put a check mark next to my name? And this virtue and others say like, no, like there are goals to be achieved and we either achieve them or we don't. Who cares about the teacher gave you a check mark or not, or a gold star? So I think that's one reason to explain it.
Sylvia asks an interesting question. How does the virtue of humility and virtue of perfectionism integrate with each other?
Sure. So I think one way to hold the virtue of perfection and humility at once is to strive for perfection while knowing that it's not necessarily going to be achievable. So let's say, you know, you're trying to minimize the number of people who die of preventable illnesses in the world. And there are some people that like give well who are basically trying to do that. So the perfectionist outlook is that any person who dies of malaria or another preventable illness is a tragedy. There's no acceptable number where we're breaking out the champagne and we did good enough. But at the same time, you know, we are human. People are going to die of malaria. So this sort of, you don't give up just because you can't get it to 0 tomorrow. But also, you don't break out the champagne until it's 0, you know. And then sometimes the number can be brought to 0. You know, polio was basically eradicated. So sometimes the goal can be achieved eventually. So you don't give up in the meantime, though.
Okay. I want to follow up on this for a minute.
Sure.
Because one of the patterns is that it's, I think, important to see connections between all these virtues. So for example, simplicity I see very much connected with perfectionism, the point that when you actually implement what you think was wrong, it sets you up to see something that you couldn't see before. The same thing with simplicity, like when you kind of, you know, make things kind of simpler, you actually start to see patterns that you did not see before, because our capacity to notice things is limited. And so there are lots of things that kind of run across many of those. And so what I want to do is I want to go to the last one now, and then that's a good place to kind of discuss that briefly, of how do all these things come together. All right, the nameless virtue. Miyamoto Musashi wrote in the book of 5 Rings, the primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Whenever you parry, hit, spring, strike, or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this. If you think only of hitting, springing, striking, or touching the enemy, you will not be able to actually to cut him. More than anything, you must be thinking of carrying your movement through to cutting him. Every step of your reasoning must cut through to the correct answer in the same movement. More than anything, you must think of carrying your map through to reflecting the territory. If for many years you practice these techniques and submit yourself to strict constraints, it may be that you will glimpse the center. Then you will see how all techniques are one technique, and you will move correctly without feeling constrained. Musashi wrote, when you appreciate the power of nature, knowing the rhythm of any situation, you will be able to hit the enemy naturally and strike naturally. All this is the way of the void. Anthony?
Great. So I'm interested in what you see as some of the themes that go through this. So one, I think, is this sense of intrinsic motivation, right? So it comes up in why wouldn't you relinquish your views, right? Because you're motivated by things other than truth. Curiosity, of course, is that intrinsic motivation, or is one. It also shows up in the sense of like heroic responsibility to do things, right? To have another purpose that was mentioned in scholarship. So this sense of motivation is one of the themes. And you see this in this like nameless virtue as like the goal is to cut, right? So that's this sort of intrinsic motivation or goal. Another theme I think is that you have to be wary of sort of social pressures other than, you know, truth or what have you, right? You don't want to just look cool fighting. You know, if you're in a fight, a sword fight, you really have to win the sword fight. So those are two of the themes I see. The other ones are sort of like around like Bayesian epistemology, sort of, you know, how do you react to evidence? How do you react to evidence quickly? How are you even-handed? How do you define simplicity, right? And that's another cluster of things.
Okay, I will bring up two things. One is I want to talk about this in respect to virtue. This is a point that the Greeks made all the time, and many thinkers, you know, throughout history, is that is virtue one or many? Because what happens is it is one in the sense that you have to do what you should be doing. But in order to figure out what that is and to implement that is, you have all these other separated virtues. And only if you can bring them and make them one in your action, they actually work. So that, I think the difference between many and one is that in virtue. The other thing is that I really like his example from physical action, because it is very easy to see it is easy to see this in action. So you see somebody who is good at martial arts, everything that needs to be done in how do you perceive things, how do you correct, all of that is being done on the fly in a fully integrated way. So I think that's, you know, that's a great example. So in terms of the kind of, I see like just this entire, you know, network of connections between all these virtues. And I don't want to go into it right now. Let's take the questions from everybody, and we'll use that to kind of weave these themes in as we go on. That makes sense?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's actually take Robert's question first. So he asked about this particular virtue. He says, is it equivalent, this nameless virtue, is it equivalent to keeping your eye on the end over just the means?
So I would say that if you fully internalize this nameless virtue, then they're sort of the same thing. Like striving, keeping your eye, like how do you actually keep your eye on it? Like you take sort of the most efficient action to achieve your goal. And then sort of like striving for the goal and achieving the goal are sort of one process in your mind. They're this one integrated way of doing things. There's no more tensions. So I would say that's sort of the idealized version of following the goal.
All right, folks. So it's now time for Q&A. So what we're going to do, we have 4 rules. One is you raise your hand. You can raise your hand by typing your question here, typing exclamation mark, or raising your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. Now, all the virtues are open for discussion, but that's what we're talking about, these virtues of rationality. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to disagree, you know, be candid, disagree with anything anybody says, but do so candidly. So it's going to be Becky, and then Joe, then John, then Dave, and then Sylvia. Becky, go ahead. You can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay. So my question is on perfectionism. And it says in the reading that rather than moving forward, you should perfect that specific skill. Otherwise, the error will come back to bite you. What is your opinion on that and its absolute truth?
Go ahead, Anthony.
So it's a hard question. I guess before I answer, Becky, could you give like a somewhat more concrete situation that you're thinking of?
Sure. For example, when I'm playing music, I will continue and I will move forward in an arrangement even if I haven't perfected it. But later on, I can come back to it. And as I progress in some of the harder techniques, the technique that I was struggling with prior becomes a lot easier.
Okay, that I think simplifies it or makes things a little clearer. So if you read, the virtues, there's a question of like putting down your foot in exactly the right spot in a dance, right? So that's the ideal. And in music, it would be sort of the same. If you're playing a violin or something, you do want to hit exactly the right note. There is this ideal, but the way of perfecting yourself isn't necessarily that you refuse to move on. It's that you sort of keep your eye on what's possible, or even beyond what you think is possible, and you move forward. So you don't necessarily accept mistakes in the sense that they're impossible to avoid, but you have to make a path forward. And in music, I mean, this is definitely somewhat true if you look at like the history of music and what pieces people think are reasonable at what skill levels. The standards do in fact seem to keep going up for music students. So, this striving has achieved forward progress, but no one would say that like a music student can't move on if they're not, hitting exactly the right note on the violin at some point,
Okay, next up is Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for presenting today. The one I have a kind of a question, and maybe it's just a disagreement with the word argument, because it tends to imply anger, which is by definition irrational. So, I mean, as far as it being a virtue, maybe in and of itself, argument is just the wrong word, but in the way it's described, it's more or less disagreement. Are they really, is it more along the lines of, instead of argument, dialogue would be a better way of looking at it virtuously?
Shrikant,
Anthony? Oh, sure, I'll take that. So I find, I look at it slightly differently. I think that we are social beings and we have limited capacity of figuring things out on our own, and we are subject to our own biases. If you actually set up the right context with other people where there is a complete respect for truth and trying to kind of explore the world jointly, then other people are actually tremendous assets for you. Because one of the key identifications in the conclusion of Daniel Kahneman's book is that somebody else's system two can tell you what's wrong with your system one than your own system two. Other people can notice, not because they're particularly smart, but because their system one is different. So they are not bound by what it is. So I think I see that point, the kind of, I look at it in a more general way of saying that use other people's feedback to correct yourself. So I think dialogue is the virtuous way of doing that, without kind of rancor produced by people trying to defend themselves from truth. Next one up is
wait,
John.
I just have
go,
like
oh, go ahead.
two quick
Please.
things there. So one tie-in with the other virtues is, like not having unusual standards of rigor for people you disagree with, right? So ideally, you would not be angry and no one in the discussion would be angry. But it's important that even if you're holding yourself to a standard where you don't get angry, just because someone else is angry does not mean that they don't have something to teach you. Like, they're maybe calling you out correctly on the facts, even if you're being more virtuous in some sense by being emotionally even. That doesn't mean that you're empirically correct. So it's important to sort of hold yourself to that standard or build a space where other people won't be angry, but not to use it to avoid criticism. Even if those people are objectively angry.
That's an excellent point. Excellent point. Okay, next up is John, then John, Dave, Sylvia, and Ed. John, go ahead.
Yeah. Basically, I'll just read what I wrote. Being rationally virtuous is pretty difficult when engaged with other people aspiring to be rationally virtuous. And but I think, as was mentioned in the text, like most of the world is not sort of aspiring to that, or does not know of it, and has not read Yudkowsky. And so we often find ourselves in situations where the people we are conversing with are not, they're either not aware or don't want to, or even incapable of this virtuousness. So how do we approach those situations? Is it something where it's sort of like a nice china set that we only take out when we know it's not going to get damaged, or is it something? How do we deal with situations when the other parties have no interest in rational virtuousness?
So I think it's important to be, again, both idealistic and practical. So don't do things that are going to cause you to be hurt in various ways, right? Like various people, they may actually be asking you questions that if you answer honestly, they're going to use to crucify you or something. Like, then, don't lie, but maybe disengage. But even if people are not being optimally virtuous, if they're intelligent or have facts you don't have, which they probably do, there are ways of learning about it. So here's one thing you can always sort of use to check. You can try to state their position on the issues in a way that they will agree is a good summary. And this is often not the easiest thing to do. You're almost never going to get it exactly right. They'll point out ways in which it's wrong. And until you're capable of doing that, there is something to learn. Whether it's the optimal allocation of your time is another story. But, it's important to not close yourself off from people, even if those people are not following the norms that you might see in this discussion group, right? They're still knowledgeable people.
Excellent. Thank you. Next one up is Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try this. Anthony, in fact, I think this may kind of extend your last comment, that it seems to me the last virtue is so final and so definite that with the sword, that I wonder if sometimes things are actually incremental, that we're in shades of gray, that could we be satisfied with just improvement instead of the final answer?
I would say it depends on the situation. So if you believe that the future is really changing and there's going to be big changes, then incremental is good, but you have to figure out what's going to happen, right? For example, let's imagine we were in like 2010 or something, talking about Bitcoin or something. And you were like, made some incremental improvement in your understanding of Bitcoin and you learned some things. Well, like if your goal was to be rich by 2020, you really had to get to the point where you bought Bitcoin. And not only that, like had some protocol for holding it, right? If you were in 2010, even if somebody convinced you to buy Bitcoin, like probably you were going to sell at some point. You bought it for $1 and it's up to $50. You weren't going to hold. So in order to get to the point where you would have really profited, like you could be rich by now, and I'm not, you needed to get to a very high level of understanding of when should we buy, but like when should we sell? What are the protocols we should use? And if you don't get there, then the $1 million prize is not yours. So some things are like that, some things are not, but there's many things like that where you need to achieve some level.
I would like to add one thing. When we're looking at Sapolsky's book, one term that he had is that have strong beliefs that are weakly held. So what this is that it's like you have to decide, you have to kind of come up with the best understanding that you can, and you have to act on it. So that's all about kind of, focusing on the cutting and doing your best. At the same time, it is weakly held in the sense it's a strong belief, so it allows you to act. At the same time, it is weakly held in the sense that when you start to see evidence that you're wrong in some way, you go ahead and transform that. So I think both those parts are important, kind of strong beliefs and weakly held. Next one up is Sylvia. Sylvia, go ahead.
Yes. So my question was at the beginning, when I first read this, I was so surprised by the language. And I went, oh my gosh, when was this written? And then I discovered he's 40 years old. He's 20 years younger than me. And he's a brilliant man who never went to school, by the way. So he's self-taught. That reminds me of someone, Mr. Shrikant. And I was just surprised by sorry, I know it's a background story. I have more of a literary background. So why did he choose this, and is writing this way, or I'm being very ignorant, but why did he write it this way? This could have been, the Stoic quote of the day is, we don't abandon our pursuits because we despair of ever perfecting them. So there we go. So why did he choose to write this way?
That's a very good quote. I wish I had known it when people were asking me questions. Great quote. I think one reason is that Eliezer believes in the value of inspiration. So if you talk to him or read his other writings, he talks about a lot of progress was made by people who literally objectively were inspired by sort of like classic sci-fi and other sort of these big dreams for the future, right? Peter Thiel talks about similar things, right? That these inspiring visions for the future are gone. Peter Thiel really despairs that a lot of sci-fi is dystopian. And so if you believe that people need like a sort of, in order to take heroic virtue seriously, they need heroic writing, then it's going to change how you choose to write things. And I think he has some reasons to believe what he does.
If for anybody who wants a more kind of literary version of this, he is actually, Eliezer has done, Harry Potter. He has, Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. That's what I would recommend. Actually, that's a very good way of seeing how these virtues come together, because art is very powerful, because what it does is that it has to implement all of these virtues. And so I would definitely recommend that. So next question is from Ed Borer. Ed, go ahead.
Yeah, hi Shrikant. I can't wait till we can get back together in Manhattan again soon, hopefully.
Me too.
My question is really simple. It's about the concept of perfection. I know Becky brought that up, but I look at perfection sort of as the enemy of the good. And we get, I know myself, and I guess so many others get stuck at a particular point when perfection is not a possibility. And I think that's a difficulty that many of us face. And I'd like you maybe to elaborate a little bit. I know it's simple, but it's a real difficulty for me and probably others too.
Shrikant, I've said some things
Sure.
about perfection.
Okay, sure. So what I would say is that there are two notions of perfection which are very different from each other. There is a killer notion of perception which will actually destroy you. And that's the Platonic notion of perfection, which holds that there is kind of, I mean, at the most extreme case is that perfection actually exists and you're trying to be that. And you can do that through insight, kind of almost direct insight. A lot of religious thinking is based on that. And that view of perfection is the commonly held view of perfection. And that's a killer because it will stop you before you even start, because it's impossible to do. The notion that Eliezer is talking about, or when we're talking about strong beliefs weakly held, is not that. It is simply your commitment to doing the best you can to implement everything that you know, to be ruthless about facing the truth, fully knowing it is completely consistent by saying that you will never achieve perfection. You will not know the territory. You will only have a map, and you're relentlessly trying to improve your map, and you're trying to take the feedback. So there is a otherworldly notion of perfection which most people hold even when they are not religious. This is rooted in Plato, and before that, I forget his name, Heraclitus and his competitor, I forget his name. That's the notion, which is what is a religious notion and which is commonly held. But this notion is very different than that. And this one is actually liberating. It is all about, it comes with lightness. It comes with relinquishment, all of that. So it's very different from that notion of perfection. Wayne.
Hey, thanks, Anthony and Shrikant. So I really like this piece. It puts rationality in heroic and poetic terms, which, as you say, is very inspirational. Though I always think, like, what's next? And so I'm thinking, like, how do I train myself in these virtues? Maybe even personally, like, are there training regimens or practices that you guys try to employ in your daily lives? I'm a person who likes to lean into 30-day plans and checklists and journal prompts. So any suggestions would be greatly appreciated.
Okay, I actually have a couple of things. Actually, there is an organization which has prepared a training plan. It's good. It's not great, but it's good. It's very good. And Anthony and I, when Anthony was here, we were actually planning to come up with a plan to do that. I have done a part of it. I've taken some of the tools, like rationality tools, and saying, okay, how do you actually internalize it? So, that's something that I would really look forward to doing at least some of it. I mean, in our meetup, we do this all the time. I mean, even the structure of the typical meetup, in-person meetup, is that we take an idea. The initial presentation presents the idea, then we take all the question and answers. Then we go into small groups with specific aim of applying that idea to our lives. Then we come back and learn about our takeaways. That's all focused on kind of internalizing ideas. So this is a project which is very close to my heart, not only in the rationality community, the rationalist ideas, but ideas in general, because ideas are useless if you don't integrate them into your life. So that is something that, I'm working on doing more things with. Anthony?
So I can just give some quick examples. I was also going to mention CFAR, Center for Applied Rationality. So There's a number of techniques that are in that manual that I would recommend, but there are some things you can do just now for sort of like fun. So I know a lot of people, at the start of the year or in the middle of the year, right? They make predictions about things. So world events, but also personal events like, will I find someone to date or something, a new partner, or will I finish writing that book that I was writing, or whatever it may be. And you put probabilities on them. And then at the end of the year, many people, they compare, they see how they did, they see if they were calibrated, which is different than accuracy, right? I mean, you could put 50-50 predictions everywhere and then you're always calibrated, but you didn't say anything. And there's things like that, you can also make it a practice when you're talking to people. Can you sort of like summarize both sides of an argument in ways that both sides will accept? So there's a lot of these things that you can do right now. And importantly, these things don't really require buy-in from everybody else, right? You can try to summarize and see if they accept it. And most people are interested if you try to do that. You can just make the predictions, It's important to hold yourself to the standards first.
All right, excellent. So we kept this on time very well. So now what we're going to do is that I'm going to open up breakout rooms so we can discuss this in great amount of detail.